So my plan here was to, and the reason that I submitted this talk was largely to come out and talk to you guys about the risks to OT infrastructure and how to assess those risks. Fortunately, this is no longer a problem. The Biden administration has directed NIST to produce a new framework that is dedicated to and focused on critical infrastructure. More importantly, we have recently seen that Black Matter has placed on their site that they will no longer attack hospitals, critical infrastructure, oil and gas industry, defense industry, nonprofit companies, or the government sector. And the White House has also indicated that this commitment by this ransomware group is evidence of the fact that there is a healthy fear of the current administration and that we no longer have concerns to worry about. So while the plan was to talk about this stuff, the reality is this problem is solved, and the bad guys have promised no longer to attack critical infrastructure or industrial sectors. So that saves us all a lot of time, and we can all go back to LobbyCon and enjoy the rest of our day, right? Obviously, joking. I don't know what delusional fantasy world the administration is currently living in, but the reality is this is absolutely still a problem. I stumbled upon this quote from a threat analyst named Brett Callow, who did an interview with CNN, and he stated, "There's absolutely no reason to believe that untrustworthy bad faith actors will stick to their word, or that they can even necessarily control their affiliates. The fact that a single group has said it will avoid attacks on critical infrastructure is neither a good sign nor a bad one. It's a meaningless nothing burger." Now, I included this quote not because I agree with it, though I do, and not because it's relevant to this talk, though it is, but instead because of the fact that meaningless nothing burger is the phrase that I apparently always needed and never realized that I needed. So I have every intention of incorporating this into my day-to-day rhetoric, and I encourage all of you to do the same. So now on to the roadmap, what we're going to be discussing. We're first going to talk about who I am. Then we're going to talk about what is operational technology. We're going to look at the history of OT and ICS exploitation, look at risks of assessing OT environments. Then we're going to talk about some methodologies that can be used in order to assess those environments while avoiding those risks. And then finally, we are going to talk about parting thoughts. So first, who am I? My name is Hutch. I can be found on Twitter at @sociosploit. I'm the security assessments practice lead at a company called Set Solutions that is located here in Houston, and I lead our technical security services. I have a master's degree in information security, and like anybody who has spent far too long in the information security sector, have the typical alphabet soup of certifications. Have spoken at multiple different conferences and delivered presentations on a wide range of different topics, and I also like to hack the weird stuff. And what I mean by that is I've kind of spent the majority of my career trying to get out of my comfort zone to make sure that anytime that there's an opportunity that I can get access to or work with something that is unique or obscure, taking those opportunities to do that. And so that has led me down multiple different paths, from car hacking, hacking Alexa devices, and in this case, talking about OT and ICS infrastructure. It is worth saying that I am not an ICS expert. I don't come from an ICS background. My background was originally in IT security, and I have spent the past 10 years through consulting in and out of ICS environments, figuring out ways to adapt those traditional assessment methodologies that I've become familiar with in IT security to the OT security environments. And so that's really what this talk is going to be about, is how to cross-apply and use some of those same methodologies, but in such a way that is useful in an ICS environment, and also in a way that doesn't incur significant risk to that environment. I am the creator of an information security blog called Sociosploit at sociosploit.com, so if you're interested in looking at any of my independent research, you can find it there. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Ready, Set, Secure, where we talk about various different information security topics and have some really interesting guests. Also, my team at Set Solutions is currently hosting a month-long CTF. We are releasing 7 challenges each week. We're currently in week 1, so there's still plenty of time to get involved. We have some fantastic prizes. If anybody wants, we also have challenge coins up here that correlate to one of the challenges in that CTF, so feel free to grab these at your leisure. So now on to the fun stuff. What is operational technology, or OT? So as I mentioned, the intention of this talk is to really appeal to people who have a background in IT security and are trying to cross-apply those skills to OT. So I felt like it was most appropriate to define operational technology in contrast to IT. So obviously we're familiar with IT as the hardware and software that supports processing of information. With operational technology, we're still talking about hardware and software, but instead we are talking about hardware and software that supports real-world interactions, so measuring, analysis of the real world, manipulation of factors within the real world. So if we call IT communication, we could call OT the execution, the doing things. So a common oversimplification that we see when discussing the distinction between IT and OT is that IT systems reside exclusively on corporate or office networks, and that OT systems reside exclusively on industrial networks. While this is generally true, it's an oversimplification because the fact is we do often see OT systems within corporate networks, anything from physical access control systems, digital security cameras, network-connected uninterrupted power supplies that you find in your data center. Similarly, we often see IT systems within ICS environments, especially within the supervisory layer or level. We're looking at stuff like databases, log servers, domain controllers. So now that we've started to muddy the waters, trying to simplify it a little bit, for our purposes, we're going to break OT down into two categories. We're going to call Internet of Things, or IoT, OT systems that exist on non-industrial networks, such as your corporate or personal networks. And then for our purposes, we're going to call OT systems, or those systems that do the things on industrial networks, ICS. Again, this is still somewhat of an oversimplification. I realize that there are also those that would argue that there are IoT devices within ICS networks where you've got IIoT or industrial IoT. The reality is, unfortunately, the discussion of semantics and the discussions of nomenclature within ICS can become so complicated that we just go down that path and we never get anything accomplished as far as discussion. So again, for our purposes, we're going to leave it at this for this discussion. If anybody does disagree, that's fine. Talk with me afterwards and we can settle it with a gentleman's duel to the death. So the reason that this matters, making this distinction, is because it is relevant to how we would go about securing these environments. The approach to security is very different within corporate and office networks and industrial networks. Obviously, the primary focus within corporate networks is the confidentiality of the data that's being handled. For industrial networks, the biggest concern is availability, making sure that the systems continue to run, and that is to make sure that there is no financial impact to the organization that's running those operations, and also for safety purposes. There's also a big distinction between how the networks interact with other systems in the outside world and untrusted networks. Specifically, you've got significantly more exposure within corporate and office networks as users are constantly interacting with email and the internet. Whereas with industrial networks, it should be very minimal and controlled interactions with those untrusted networks. Similarly, the environment within corporate and office networks is something that's constantly changing. You're constantly spinning up and handling new services, new systems. Not the case within industrial networks, where the entire environment is relatively static. So where do we find OT? The truth is OT is all over the place. We obviously, within our industrial control systems, find those mostly within our industrial sectors: manufacturing, energy, agriculture, transportation, and shipping. When we start talking about IoT, we really find these absolutely everywhere. With healthcare, we're starting to see network-connected medical devices. Within automotive industry, cars at this point are pretty much OT networks on wheels. Within the consumer market, you've got all kinds of different products that are OT or IoT, stuff like your Alexa device that you might interact with at home, or the robot vacuum cleaners that tend to spew shit all over your house. So, bringing it back to ICS, there's some historical challenges that we continue to run into as it pertains to securing and to assessing these environments. Ultimately, these become the untouchable devices, the devices that you're frequently told, don't touch these, don't secure these, don't harden these, because if you do, things are going to break and people are going to die. Unfortunately, there has been a history of insecurity as far as the design of these products, especially as you get lower in the levels of the Purdue model, as you get closer to the actual field-level devices. Stuff like your actuators, your sensors, PLCs, RTUs often lack some of the standard security controls that we take for granted within IT networks. We also have significant environmental complexity, and this is especially for somebody if you're coming from the IT world and trying to approach the OT environment. You've got likely a wide range of different protocols that you've never seen before and systems that do things that you're completely not familiar with. Additionally, you frequently run into interoperability restrictions. So within IT environments, you can kind of go best of breed with whatever systems you want to execute on any particular function. Within ICS networks, you're generally pigeonholed into a single vendor. Once you settle on a vendor, whether that's Siemens or Honeywell or Yokogawa, you pretty much have to operate within their ecosystem, otherwise you can lose support or certification of those environments. However, we are seeing changing within the OT environment. We are starting to see modernization of hardware and software and an increasing standardization, especially with protocols. We're starting to see a lot of those protocols move towards Ethernet instead of just broadcast signaling protocols on a bus. And as such, certain protocols are starting to make that cut, whereas others aren't, and that's starting to minimize the amount of variety across the environment. That being said, there is still a large number of protocols that you likely will have to contend with. We're starting to see vendors take security more seriously as far as the way that they're building these devices. And while we are seeing these factors that are improving security within the ICS environments, it also is a mixed bag because on the other side of things, we're seeing increased exposure. We're starting to see remote operations, people that are managing ICS networks from home. And of course, that was already starting to happen, but was even further exacerbated with COVID-19. Third-party integrations is another case where we're starting to see remote access being required. We're seeing more and more hands in the cookie jar, so to speak. And because we have other people that are managing those networks, they need to be able to access those networks as well. And then, of course, the typical buzz phrase of digital transformation, this idea that we now want to do predictive analytics to identify failures before they occur by doing various different censoring and measuring of the systems that are doing the censoring and the measuring. And this process is largely, we're seeing cases where a lot of that aggregate data and that telemetry data is being shipped either to IT, OT, DMZ environments, or in some cases even out to the cloud. So now that we've talked about what OT is, let's talk about the history of ICS and OT exploitation. So in 2010, something happened that some of you may be familiar with. It's Stuxnet. So for anybody that has been living under a rock, this essentially was the first major documented event where you had malware that had a catastrophic impact on the industrial operations of an organization. And this was the case where we had malware that was intended to self-propagate, would move from system to system using different SMB exploits, would also move to USB or removable media as they were plugged into those infected systems. It was then able to use the infections on those USB devices to jump onto air-gapped networks, which was ultimately its goal. Once it was on those different networks, it would analyze the network in order to determine if it was on a network that had Siemens systems that were managing centrifuges that were used for uranium enrichment, and specifically in an effort to sabotage the Iranian program for developing nuclear power. Since 2010, we've seen a whole slew of things happen. 2013, we saw the first case of an ICS attack on something within the United States, which was the Bowman Venue Dam in New York. 2014, we saw researchers from the University of Michigan who demonstrated that with a chain of exploits, they were able to take over Michigan traffic lights. 2015, we saw the Russians infiltrate and cause a blackout within the Ukrainian power grid. 2017, we saw the rise of NotPetya affecting a large number of different industrial organizations. 2017, 2018, we saw the rise of Trisis and Triton, which was malware that targeted the Schneider Electric SIS systems, which are the safety instrumented systems. And this sounds just as bad, or this is just as bad as it sounds. These are systems that determine if certain unsafe thresholds are met within systems within the environment and then alert on those. So obviously, attacks against these systems can have significant detrimental effects on your industrial operations. 2019, we started seeing ransomware really impact the industrial environment, from ASCO to Norsk Hydro. 2020, we saw even more ransomware affecting these environments, from Enel to Honda. 2021, now we have Colonial Pipeline, one of the most significant impacts to industrial infrastructure within the United States. And also within 2001, we saw attacks on a Florida water treatment plant where somebody accessed a remotely exposed VNC service in order to gain access to their water treatment plant and increase the levels of sodium hydroxide in order to poison people within Florida. So, the simple message here is that OT infrastructure is under attack. These attacks are becoming more frequent, they're becoming bigger, they're becoming badder. And the reality is we want to take these stories and make them more than just stories. We need to learn lessons from them. We need to analyze and understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were used by the adversaries within these scenarios in order to craft our assessment methodologies. So, before we talk about how we're going to go about doing those risk assessment methodologies, let's talk about the risks of assessing OT environments and what's the worst that could happen. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're often told about these systems: don't patch, don't scan, don't reconfigure, don't update, don't even look at these systems, because if you do, you will break them and people will die. And of course, this is what I encountered, as many do, when coming from an IT security background and trying to approach OT security. But personally, I had heard this before, and likely, regardless of what sector you work in, you may have as well, because there are many different systems in almost every industry that people think are the fragile snowflakes, we can't touch these, the untouchables, so to say. When I worked in local government, you had the 911 systems that triangulated calls and told people, our emergency responders, where callers were coming from. And we were told, don't touch these systems, don't do anything with them. If you do, you will break them, people will die. In the Defense Department, when I worked for the Air Force, we had field systems that were directly supporting the warfighter. Again, don't touch these systems. If you do and you break them, people will die. In finance, you have your transaction processing and mainframes. People won't die directly if you touch these, but the executives might kill you. And then in healthcare, of course, you have your network-connected medical devices, which are directly connected to patients. And again, you can't touch these, people will die. So regardless of what environment you're coming from, there are likely lessons that you've experienced from systems like these, where you have to rely on compensating controls and white glove approaches for assessment methodologies in order to really be able to address the security of these systems. And so what we want to do is take those lessons and then cross-apply them to OT. What they often don't tell you is that for OT environments, ICS systems are much more resilient than they're made out to be. You constantly hear these stories of they're going to fall over if you touch them. The truth is, most SCADA systems are software that's running on Windows operating systems. PLCs are often embedded Linux systems. The truth is, they sin, synac, and act just like the rest of them. That is to say, if you do a port scan on these, they're not going to react any differently. OT systems are built with the idea of resiliency in mind. The manufacturers are thinking, what can we do to build this in such a way that it will not stop working no matter what? And so the truth is, you could pretty much light up one of these networks full blast with a vulnerability scanner, and most likely, nothing would happen. So, now that we've said that, in that case, how do we go about performing a penetration test in an ICS network? The simple answer is, you don't. Because the truth is that while the likelihood of failure within these environments is often overhyped, the potential impact associated with the failure is not. And so we can consider two different situations, kind of coming back to that IT-OT difference. In an IT environment, if you're going to be doing a penetration test, let's say that you're targeting a print server, and there's a 1% chance that that print server is going to fall over and people are going to be unable to print for 15 minutes. On the other hand, let's say that you're trying to do a penetration test within an ICS network, and you are targeting a system, let's say on an environment where they are mixing nitrogen and ammonium. And if you knock over that system, still maybe a 1% chance of failure, but if that occurs, then you get this. And so the reality is we still have to be very careful when approaching these environments and crafting the methodologies that we go about using when assessing these environments. It's also worth saying that most likely, even if you were to do a penetration test and use some of the standard tools and methodologies that you use with an IT or within an IT environment, within an ICS environment, you likely wouldn't get very far anyways. A lot of these tools are tailored specifically for IT systems. You have different systems in OT, you have different protocols. So fortunately, there are other ways that we can go about assessing the security of an ICS environment. And so finally, that is what we're here to talk about, is assessment methodologies that won't break things and kill everyone. So before we start talking about those methodologies, it's worth mentioning that anytime you're assessing an ICS environment, you need to have an assessment risk management system. That is to say, you should have risk management processes that relate to the way that you're assessing risk, because those risk assessments themselves can have risk. And unfortunately, I don't make the rules, but the reality is you need to have one. A few tenets that should exist within any assessment risk management program is identification. You should be intimately familiar with any of the systems that you're performing any kind of testing on. A defined scope that is mutually agreed upon, and not just what systems are in scope, but all of the activities that you are going to be conducting. And that should be mutually agreed upon by the testing team, by the asset owners, and any of the stakeholders that are involved. Ongoing communication throughout the entire process, and then authorization. Ultimately, if the people that own and run the systems are not in agreement with you performing any particular testing, you probably shouldn't be doing it. So let's talk about some of those assessment methodologies. We're going to talk initially about GRC assessments, architecture reviews, passive traffic analysis, and scenario-based testing. And if it seems like I went through those fast, it's because we're going to cover each one individually. So first, GRC assessments. And breaking that down too, we're first going to talk about governance. Governance can pretty much be summed up by, do your personnel know what is expected of them and what they should be doing? So this pertains to both your overarching strategy for your security program, which oftentimes we're seeing more and more is kind of straddled across both your OT environments and your IT environments, with the same security management team addressing both of those. And while that's not a problem, the implementation of that security strategy is often going to be very different. But it also gets down to the very specific processes that define what people should be doing. You can perform risk assessments. So obviously, identifying threats and exposures, and what we want to do from there is, and so just doing your traditional threat mapping type approach. Then we want to enumerate controls within the environment. So what are our detective and administrative controls that mitigate those risks? And then cross-reference those controls against the threats and exposures that we've identified in order to identify any kind of gaps related to potential threats to our environment. And this shouldn't be a one-time thing. You should have an ongoing risk management program that tracks issues until they're addressed, that validates remediation when they are supposedly addressed. We also want to have a very clear process for risk acceptance, and this is one of the most common things that I see organizations not doing well, or in a lot of cases not doing at all, is nobody wants to take any ownership for risk. And the reality is there are very good reasons for accepting risk within organizations, and having a process that allows you to go through those and document justifications as to why you're accepting risk in one area or another absolutely has to exist. And finally, understanding your coverage for risk transference. So obviously an increasingly relevant topic that we're seeing is the topic of cyber insurance. And being intimately familiar with the specific terms and conditions of what you need to be doing in order for that coverage to kick in, or what areas that coverage will even relate to, is something that you absolutely need to be familiar with. And then for areas that you aren't sufficiently covered, you need to have those compensating controls. Compliance. So Obviously, there's some regulatory standards in various different industries like NERC-CIP that establish a good baseline, obviously keep you from paying fines. Anybody that's doing security within the ICS environment should be familiar with NIST SP 882 because it is one of the best specifically tailored sets of guidance to ICS environments and security. But a lot of organizations may have already settled on a security framework, and there are a lot of them, that they're using in the IT environment, and maybe the management is the same, that, like I said, is straddling IT and OT, and they want to reuse that security framework. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because using any security framework, even if it isn't specifically tailored to ICS, is better than starting from scratch. And there are also mappings that you can find for nearly any framework on the internet, and all you have to do is just do a little bit of Google of whatever framework I'm wanting to apply, what are the mappings to an ICS environment, and it'll tell you what controls are applicable and how you can apply those controls within an ICS environment. And also more to come. So we, again, have Joe Biden's administration has now commissioned the introduction of a new standard. They are working with NIST, so I am hopeful to see what comes out of that. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the standards that already exist are kind of redundant anyways, so I'm not sure if a new standard is what we need, but I think it is worth keeping our eyes out for what comes of this and how it is relevant to the ICS environment and securing those. Another way to approach security assessments is architecture reviews. So anybody that's worked within an ICS environment is probably familiar with the Purdue Model. Some would argue that this is becoming less and less applicable with the changing architecture of ICS environments. But I do think that one of the things that is a fantastic takeaway for the Purdue Model is the emphasis on isolation and segmentation of specific process lines. And so that's one thing that we can absolutely focus on is what is our segmentation strategy, making sure that we're implementing least privilege throughout the network. Zero trust actually works exceptionally well in ICS, and this is because of the fact that, as I mentioned, ICS networks don't change often. They're fairly static environments, and so being able to explicitly deny communications implicitly deny communications by default, and then only create explicit cases for when communications should be allowed is much easier than it is within an IT environment. And also we can perform technical testing, anything from looking at firewall ACL reviews to also performing access testing, sending communications across one given boundary and seeing if we can access or receive those communications on the other. Security control reviews are still pertinent within ICS environments. Obviously, host-based controls where possible, and we are seeing more and more ICS vendors that are becoming more flexible with the introduction of AV or host-based controls. Also, where allowed, application whitelisting is another capability that in ICS environments is much easier to implement because of the fact that you have these SCADA systems that are generally only running a handful of binaries. And so blocking it down to just X, Y, and Z binaries are the only ones that are allowed to execute and deny all else is something that is fairly easy to do. Again, the biggest obstacle is getting your ICS vendor to approve you in actually implementing those controls on those host-based systems. Obviously, where you can't implement host-based controls, compensating controls are your friends. Strong access controls for both physical and network, looking at network visibility, data analytics, and anomaly detection, and then how you manage access throughout the environment. Passive traffic analysis. So as an alternative to active vulnerability scanning, one of the best ways that we can assess the vulnerabilities within an ICS environment is by passively listening on the wire. So this is creating a tap that allows us to look at all traffic across the entire network and then analyzing that traffic. And there's a lot of tools that already exist in order to do this. In truth, the most effective approach is a combination of using those automated tools, which, just like regular vulnerability scanners, will miss things, and also having somebody manually look through, see, and again, these environments are fairly static, so it's not the constantly changing protocols and communications that you see within an IT network. So somebody can go through, look at those PCAPs and analyze what protocols are being used, and then review what the best hardening recommendations and best implementation practices are for those protocols. Also scenario-based testing. So penetration testing can be used to assess whether or not an attacker can get to your OT network in the first place, and this is something that I absolutely recommend. Testing from both the perspective of the public internet and also testing from the perspective of your IT network to see if an attacker could potentially gain access to the DMZ between your IT and OT network. This could be done by targeting dual home systems that sit in both environments. Hopefully those don't exist, but they often do. Segments that support communications across those two environments, such as your DMZs, and then also personnel that may have access to both the IT network and the OT network. We've seen in the past actual real-world incidents where IT users were phished via their email. Their credentials were compromised, and then it was found that they were using the same credentials in order to access remote VPNs into the OT environment, and this allowed access to those industrial systems. This can be performed black box, but in reality, when you're on a time crunch and have budget constraints like most organizations do, it's best to kind of do that testing side by side with the network map to understand what systems are sitting in that DMZ and kind of do a tailored and targeted assessment against those systems. So talking about tactics, techniques, and procedures, MITRE has released an attack framework that is specific for ICS environments. And for anybody that hasn't used the MITRE attack framework, this is a fantastic tool that breaks down most of the commonly used tactics, techniques, and procedures, but also as you drill down into these, it gives you instances of where these techniques have been used in the real world, whether by malware or by threat actors. And it also tells you recommendations for what detective and preventative controls can be implemented in order to mitigate each of these different techniques. I would highly recommend a test environment, and this is something that we don't see nearly enough. Most organizations do not have this, and generally when I recommend this to anybody that has or manages an ICS environment, their immediate thought is, I can't possibly have a second factory site or this entire ICS environment. And the truth is, the most critical part of your ICS environment is that site supervisory level, which is in most cases 1 to 2 server racks. And I mean, you don't have to focus on every single one of the individual process lines, but instead, if you replicate that environment, then you can perform testing on a lot of the different TTPs, and you can do it in such a way that there is no risk to your actual production OT environment. Obviously, some techniques within the MITRE attack framework can be executed in such a way that's relatively low risk. Things like just seeing if you can plug in removable media into the network or a rogue device. Obviously, if you have DHCP enabled on your OT network, then you have serious problems to begin with. And then looking at just reviewing domain controller hashes in order to identify whether or not people are reusing the same passwords on the OT and IT side. But there's other techniques that you absolutely would never want to do or test within a live environment, stuff like man-in-the-middle attacks, brute forcing I/O, spoofed messaging protocols. So these techniques can be addressed conversationally in order to understand what kind of compensating controls exist that might address these controls, but they can also be handled through a lab environment, which again is kind of your ideal scenario. In all cases, err on the side of caution. So if there are any concerns from yourself, from the asset holders, from the stakeholders, any doubts, don't ever test in a live environment. Tabletop exercise is a fantastic way to test your incident response and your preparedness for when real-world events do occur. And this has historically been used within the military to address kind of doomsday, worst-case scenario situations. And this can also be just as effectively applied to ICS environments, where we consider kind of the worst-case possible scenario, and then what procedures do we have in place, and then talk through those procedures in order to understand what the organization's response would be if those events were to occur. So, parting thoughts. Obviously, your organization needs to allocate budget for OT security. This is absolutely critical. Also, familiarize yourself with OT-specific security solutions. There are, and honestly, HouSecCon is one of the best places that you can find to identify vendors that are doing some really cool stuff as far as security within ICS. It's also worth saying that you should be, if you're moving from IT to OT and trying to assess those environments, familiarize yourself with the actual systems that you're going to be encountering. And while you may not be able to always get a hold of some of those specific field devices, there are a lot of opportunities for getting access to stuff that resembles it, such as there's OpenPLC now that you can install on Raspberry Pis. There's a similar SCADA service that's also from the same group that does OpenPLC, which also allows you to implement your own HMIs or your human-machine interfaces. And so working with these can give you familiarity with kind of the tolerance of those systems and how you can interact with them, and it can also give you familiarity with some of the protocols that you would likely see within these environments. And finally, as any organization, you should always continue to pressure your ICS vendors to advance security. One of the biggest problems that we continue to see is that vendors are inflexible because of the fact that they know that organizations have spent millions of dollars to implement them and they are not going to change vendors. And so unfortunately, that is inherently a problem. My biggest recommendation there is just absolutely lie. The vendor organizations, if they believe that there is an appetite for potentially changing your entire environment to a different vendor, and they realize the potential costs that that could cause, you can, and especially with larger organizations, you can really throw your weight around and really implement change within these vendors. So I would encourage you, with any of the ICS vendors that you're using, have discussions with them, explain what security controls you would like to see in place, explain what your concerns are, and make it a partnership in order to try to continue to push this industry forward. So, thank you for real this time, and open any questions that anybody has.
What are your thoughts on using a breach attack simulator for OT?
Because of the fact that most breach and attack simulations are tailored to IT environments, I would be very hesitant, and also especially without knowing exactly what's happening under the hood with every single one of those TTPs, unless you've picked apart and understand everything that it's going to be doing, I would not recommend it. Yes, in the back.
You talked about Purdue Model as a security model, and I think the original paper was actually written literally for safety procedures. What are your thoughts on it being conflated into a cybersecurity model?
I would agree with that. I think it definitely has been exaggerated as that, and I think that we are seeing, and for anybody that didn't hear, the question was the Purdue model was originally implemented as a safety specification, and has kind of, a lot of people have kind of adopted it or evangelized it as this security model. Personally, I think that the biggest value that we're seeing come from the Purdue model is that emphasis on isolation. Especially with the difficulty of performing or applying host-based controls on a lot of the systems within these environments, that isolation becomes an absolutely critical compensating control. So I think that it does provide security value, and I think that's probably why people have latched onto it as a security model, though agreed, it really isn't intended to be such. Any other questions? All right, fantastic. One final plug. We have challenge coins for anybody that may have come in after we started. We are hosting a Capture the Flag, so if you enjoy technical challenges, or if you just want one of the challenge coins, feel free to come up and grab these. And thank you all.